Well, so I just totally phased out there for a few moments, okay. What's up, kids? How are you today? I think we're on, this is like episode 58 or something like that. Let's have a quick gander where we are in the old spectrum of getting things done on the podcast. We've not got much left of this year in terms of the podcast. We're getting to that point. Where September is on the horizon, and we all know that I take a break in December because December is a busy ass month. Apologies for my voice, by the way, today. I've been having a migraine for about 3 days now, and this is day 3 of what I like to call aftershock. Aftershock is a terrible drink, but it is also what I call the headaches, which you receive post migraine. You can't just have a migraine and then lose a migraine. You have to have it and then receive the headaches for days afterwards. This would be episode 59. Look at that. We're almost up to 60 episodes of Yelling at Concrete. And thank you for listening. Thank you for coming back. And I know, this isn't the biggest podcast in the world, let's face it. But at the same time, it's one which I'm very passionate about. I really enjoy doing, and I really appreciate when people listen to it. And I appreciate when people kind of get involved, send me comments, point out things to me. The last one I had with my gran, had some lovely comments about her. Thank you for that. That was incredible. And speaking of audience, this week I have thrown the ball to yourselves on my Patreon. If you have me on Patreon, I threw up. That sounds awful. I threw up on Patreon. I threw up on the patrons. It's the lowest. It costs $1 for me to throw up on you. I threw up a question on the Patreon to ask people if there was anything they would like me to discuss in the coming weeks. And Sean Button there threw me a question and asked, does the artist make it art, or does the audience? Do the artists and the audience have different answers to that? And if so, why is that? Now, I warn you, this is a topic which will make me ramble like no tomorrow, because obviously the definition of art is quite subjective, and it's quite organic as a way of viewing things. Art itself is subjective. Everyone takes something else and something different from it. But the definition of art as well is also quite subjective. And we're going to go around in a few circles. I can tell we're going to go around in a few circles. And this is a question which comes up quite a lot. Because especially with modern art, if you're not into modern art, or modern art isn't something which you've looked into, a lot of it can just seem pointless. Like we've boldly accepted the classics of, painting and vistas and portraits and all that kind of stuff. We've coyly accepted that. The whole world has accepted that because you're introduced to that very young. Cartoons and films and stories, they introduce you to things like the Mona Lisa and Da Vinci and all these things. Say all these things, like that sums up the entirety of classical art and just the Mona Lisa and Da Vinci, but it's a prominent feature in that, so I'm going with it. And you're introduced to this very young, and you accept that as art. You're not really introduced to modern art, and for a lot of people, modern art becomes a bit of a joke. It becomes a bit of a stand and laugh situation where you go, oh look, yeah, this person's put a random canvas, which is a singular colour, in an art gallery. Oh. It's not really art though, is it? And it is a problem. It's a problem which, we're gonna. Well, we're not gonna solve it today. Let's face it. We're never gonna solve this. This isn't something which you solve because the story changes as you go. That's why there's different art movements. I type modern art into Google, and what's the first few images I get? Well, essentially the first few images I get are a lot of surrealist stuff, and a lot of expressionist stuff. But I wouldn't class any of this really as modern art. A lot of this is just what people think is modern art. A lot of this is really mass-produced. Jesus. But there's a Rothko in there. There's a Rothko just kind of sitting there. That's interesting Google search, actually. What is revealed when you Google modern art? How is that on modern art? That's a Van Gogh. That's not modern. Oh, dear. And of course there's a difference between art and fine art and all that kind of thing. I mean, modern fine art, what if I search that? So modern art, and interesting. Wikipedia describes modern art includes artistic work produced during the period extending roughly from the 1860s to the 1970s, and denotes the styles and philosophy of the art produced during that era. Now, that's interesting, because you would consider things in galleries now which are being produced modern art. And yet, according to Wikipedia, there is not. But I'm aware I've got very off point. Well, I'm not off point. I'm still pretty on point compared to most days. Okay. So the easiest way to tackle this, I already realised this was going to be a ramble and a half. The easiest way for me to tackle this is to start off by saying that art, before we even discuss audience, is defined personally by people. Everyone will have their own personal definition of what makes something art and what makes something not art. And I have discussed this before in podcasts. If you have watched podcasts, my own personal definition of art is that, okay, so I make a pure distinction between art and expression. Something can be expressive, something can be technically brilliant, but not art. Art, to me, I'm going to say art a lot, and it's going to sound weird because I've got an odd accent. Art to me is something which is made, which has intention, or not even has intention, something which is made which has a conceptual depth past just the visual, and often is intended to evoke an emotional response in the viewer or listener, or however you want to do, because, sound art is a thing, and touch art is a thing. So, that's my personal definition of what something which could be considered art is. Which does mean that you can get things like corporate art, because they are designed to ignite a emotional response. Usually that is a positive emotional response. But nonetheless, it's an emotional response. And it also means that, in my viewpoint, that things which are technically brilliant but made with no conceptual value aren't really art. They are technically brilliant, and they can be wonderful examples of craft and skill, but in order to be under my personal banner of art, they don't fall. Which may disappoint people, I don't know. But then who cares? Who gives a damn about what I think, okay? So that's my personal definition of art. Which means, if you have made something and drawn something, regardless of the technical skill, and you intend that to have an emotional response from somebody else, then that is a piece of art. That could be considered a piece of art. Whether it's good art or bad art is a whole other argument. That's something which I discussed in another podcast. That's, anyone can make art. That's a whole banner. That's the Ratatouille attitude. Anyone can cook. Doesn't mean anyone should cook. Anyone can make art. Doesn't mean anyone should make art, because some people are very good at it and some people are crap at it. It is something which you can learn and adjust, as well as some people being just gifted at it. Anyway. I'm getting off point. And it also means, the whole idea of having found art is something which someone didn't necessarily make with an intention. It's when you see things like painted walls or industrial complexes, and you photograph them, and in a way, those structures weren't made to ignite an emotional response from you. They were fit for purpose buildings, and structures, and I'm just making noises now. My brain is just slowly falling away like damp cake. And you'll see it, and you have an emotional response, and it wasn't intended, but because it does, then it can be considered art. That's my personal expression. Now that's the first argument in these comments, which will come, and it's the same with poetry. It's the same with the written word. You know, if you're intending something to be art, then it's art. You know, you write yourself a little limerick. It's intended to make someone laugh. That's art. Comedy is art. That's a huge debate between comedians. A lot of people don't see it as a craft. They see it as, we make people laugh. That's what we do. And others really see it as a craft. There's a great show on Netflix in a minute called Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. Contains multiple things which I enjoy: comedians, cars, and coffee. I'm not that into cars. The other two I can take. And it's hosted by Jerry Seinfeld. And he is a person who truly believes that comedy is a craft. And like anything, like theatre, like drama, it is as pure a craft as anything else. And that's an art form. Which then brings us to audience. Now, do we consider audience multiple people? Do we consider audience a singular person? And do we consider ourselves our audience? Those are three things which, straight out the gate, you need to consider when you consider your audience. Now, I did, what did I do at uni? I did contemporary lens media. Contemporary lens media is a fancy way of saying film and photography in art form. Now, that course was meant to teach you how to gauge audience reaction, essentially. It's something you had to take into context every project you did, because it's a huge part of what you do. I can hear it beeping. I think it's coming from outside. Don't worry about it. Okay. And it's something which you kind of, you dive into and you go, okay, I'm making this piece. How will this make the audience feel? And that's why you have things like feedback sessions. And it's to get that initial view of how people react to that work. And in some ways you can ignore some of it because you know how something reacts. Like you show someone something which is horrifying or grotesque, the likelihood is they're going to react as horrified as anyone else. There's going to be different levels of that. In the same way as if you show something which is kind of beautiful, you're going to get a nice positive response. But the caveat of audience is that, to me, if something is really, like, anything can be art, but there is a level of interaction required with an object or with a piece to be considered art. If you, let's say you did drawings. I'm taking drawings because it's something I do. You take drawings and you did millions of them throughout your entire life. And you kept them to yourself. You know, you filled journals with them. Fill cupboards with books and each one was these drawings. It doesn't matter whether they're good or bad. If you never intend to show those to people, that would not be art, necessarily. It would be art if they were created by you with the intent to get an emotional reaction from other people. But the fact that you are unwilling to show them to people declassifies them as art. So what are they? They are expression, and that is an important distinction. They are an emotional expression, which is great. It's something which I believe everybody should do, and that's the purest distinction between it. Is you've created something and you don't necessarily intend to show anyone. And you've just kept it to yourself, but that's fine. It's an expression. It is personal art in a way. But this is the problem with art. You can say art in 50 million different ways, and it'll have 100 million different meanings. And there's no pronunciation difference apart from the fact that some people pronounce it art and some people pronounce it art, which is how I pronounce it. Because I'm terrible, and we all know that, right? So you've made all these drawings and you kept them to yourself, and that is creative expression. That's an expression piece which you are doing. Now, The problem, of course, with this is that there is layers to this. So let's say you did this. You created, 1,000 drawings and you kept them all to yourself. And maybe you tell someone about this. Or maybe you don't tell someone about this. Maybe they just discover this. That moment within there has become a piece of fine art. Because that will have an emotional reaction to the person who discovers that you've been doing this for years. So suddenly, whilst your drawings weren't intended to be art, they suddenly become art because an audience has interacted with them outside your own depth and given that extra layer to it, that extra layer of, oh wow, this person does this, and this must mean this, and there's a conceptology behind it all, and why did they hide them, and why were they ashamed with them, and blah, 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 blah. And you can stack layers and layers and layers of concept here, and instantly has become art. And in a way, that's the difference between good art and fine art. Good art and bad art is that level of depth. If something is just surface level, meant to be art, then you're missing out on a whole wealth of information which just isn't being seen, and therefore it's bad. Does that make sense? Like, if you're ignoring all the conceptual layers of your own piece, then that's bad art. Someone shouldn't have to have, a doctorate in fine art, and they shouldn't have to have a vested interest in fine art to be able to see at least some of the layers. Yeah, sure, you can go into getting all the ins and outs and all the symbology and conceptual meaning in every single piece, and that's the kind of learning technique will provide you. But to everybody, me, the world at large, you need to be able to look at something and see more than one layer of depth for it to be a successful piece of fine art. That's my personal opinion, for it to be a successful piece of fine art. But back to the question at hand. So does that mean that the artist makes the art or the audience makes the art? What if you make something with the intention of it never being seen? Is that not concept enough to be considered art? That would be the question, right? That's the point of context. That's the catch-22. If you make a sculpture and your entire purpose of that sculpture is never to be seen, surely that would be considered art. And that's a no, from my opinion. Because if you make that sculpture, you intend it never to be seen, the fact that nobody knows about it means that you are not living up to the concept. It's invisible. It's an invisible piece. It's just creative expression at that point. The whole idea of art, for me, is that it has an emotional or physical response in the audience. That's what I try and do, which sounds incredibly pretentious. But anything I create, I'm trying to trigger something in you. I'm trying to get you to think. For the most part, that's essentially what I kind of, my goal is when I create work, is that I'm trying to get you to consider your surroundings and consider the world at large. And I think art should do that. And the only way to do that is to have an audience, because even if you make something and it gives you an emotional response, you're missing the layers which could come from having an audience, and which do come from having an audience, because everyone's going to interpret something different, because everyone has a different life. Everyone's had different experiences. You draw a picture of a baby and you show it to someone who has a baby and you show it to someone who doesn't have a baby, you're going to get two very different responses. It's all about that contextualization of it. And without audience, you have no contextualization. You have an invisible piece. You could even, you could put that sculpture, which you're never going to show anybody, in a little box, and then put that box in the gallery. Then your sculpture doesn't even really, it doesn't matter what's inside the box. Because by giving it a surrounding and giving it contextualization, you've solved it. It's become art. It's become suddenly a piece. It's become something to consider and see and involve yourself in. So there needs to be this link. Now, the second part of Sean's question was that if audience has a different answer to what makes art than the artist does. And the definite answer to that is yes. And that's because you can't control where your audience comes from. In the same way as, okay, so we're going to take a what's the word? A well-known example of, is this art? Can it be considered art? The main example of this is Duchamp's toilet. You know, the Mut toilet. Fountain, as it is described. It is one of the most well-known pieces of art, and it is usually the one which will separate people from people who are studying art and people who are not studying art. And that is not bad. That is great. People who aren't studying art aren't wrong, by the way. Just throwing this out there. If you think people who don't understand art or people who don't consider something like fountain art are wrong, you're ignorant. You're just completely ignoring your audience. And by doing that, there's a likelihood you just make bad art because you're not considering what people view when they view the world. So, okay, so Fountain, if you don't know, is a ready-made sculpture by Marcel Duchamp in 1917. I'm reading this off Wikipedia, by the way. I'm not just a fountain of knowledge on art. It's a porcelain urinal, signed R.Mutt, titled Fountain. It was an ordinary piece of plumbing, chosen by Duchamp, rotated 9 degrees on its axis, and was submitted for exhibition at the Society of Independent Art. So there you go. It's just a urinal. It is a urinal laid down and signed. Now, to a general audience who, from their youth, have been told that art is defined as things like paintings and sculptures which have taken time and effort to produce, something like this is quite easily just ignored. It's seen as a novelty. It's seen as completely pointless. Yet the fact that they're asking these questions and the fact that they're reacting like that and the fact that it was designed in a way to be seen like that makes it art. It's there's a thing. There was a thing a while back where some students went into an art gallery and put a pineapple just on a white table. You know, those little white stands. And they came and they did that, and a few weeks later they went back and someone had put a glass case around it. They'd done it to make fun of fine art. To go, oh, well, you know, anything can be art. And they were right, anything can be art, because as soon as they placed it in the gallery as something to view, as, you know, for the audience to view, it became a piece of fine art. It became a conceptual notification. And so the gallery just claimed it. They claimed it as a thing. They go, right, okay, it's now a piece of fine art. I mean... You can't have one without the other. So, audience's interpretation of what is art and what isn't art is always going to be this mix. And in a way, as an artist, you need to consider that they will not see what you're creating as art. And you either need to do one of two things. One, accept that and make that as part of your piece. In places like Duchamp, people like Duchamp did so. You know, they fully embraced that whole idea that people were not going to accept it and enjoy it, and that they might try and suppress the piece of work which was being made. Or you need to combat that and alter your work in a way that everyone would consider it art. You know, and a lot of that kind of thing which comes down to it is showing your working in a way. People really appreciate art more when they know the history of it. When you go to exhibitions and you go to see things, usually that whole diatribe you see on the wall is just about how the art came to be. So you've got a little bit of context about the artist and the work which is being made. And for the general public, that's a very important piece. So it's amazing when I see people ignore it. You know, you walk in, there's this little diatribe where they give you this little slip of paper and they go, this is all about the artist's work. And instead people just wander around and going, okay, I like this picture and I don't like that picture. But that's their interpretation. That's how they interact with that. So not only is it important to have this relation between the work you're creating and the expression you're doing and the audience, which makes it all together a collection which could be called art, it's so much more important to consider the interpretations which will be happening with your work, and that not everyone has the same viewpoint of you. I mean, I've just given an in-depth, with like 26-minute review of how I do art and how I think art should be defined. And it's probably completely wrong to what you're seeing or what you're viewing. Because we're very different people. You haven't had the life I've had. I haven't had the life you've had. And that's why this is just a ramble of everything kind of thing. So it's the same with poetry. We'll stab into the poetry community. You know, if you're writing poem after poem after poem after poem, that's great. They're poems. They're creative expressions of yourself. They're diatribes into your personal and emotional psyche. Or they're technically brilliant, or they're not. You know, there is some bad poetry out there. If you're keeping it all to yourself, never to be read or heard or seen by anybody else, then you're neglecting yourself of that audience reaction. Therefore, you're only making it for yourself, and therefore it is only creative expression. It is a form of art, but not art itself, because art has multiple meanings, as we have just discussed. Oh my god. Anyone need a cigarette? I base this show on a film called Coffee and Cigarettes, and I did wonder the other day whether I should just start smoking on the show, but that would be a bad start. I do have a pipe, but I don't want to listen to you just sucking on things. I'm terrible, sorry. I can't help walking into those kind of situations. And again, that sounds awful. But I don't know. I'm kind of curious what you all think, and I'm curious what you think of my own definition. You know, am I being too blasé about it? Am I being too focused on it? Some people might think that my definition of art is too rigid, in a way that there needs to be more fluidity to it, and then others might not. Others might think that it's very fluid, because in a way I accept everything as art. Whether you intend it to be or not, if you intend it to be out there in public eye, you're automatically giving it an audience. You know, you paint a fence in your back garden. People are going to see that. People are going to interpret that, whether they take multiple levels of conceptual meaning from it, and therefore it is good or bad art. I mean, if you apply my meaning as a logical base to everything, it means we're not surrounded by anything. There's no such thing as a mundane object. There's no such thing as a non-artistic object. It just means we're surrounded by levels of good and bad art, because it's based on the audience reaction. You know, you look at a wooden fence which has been painting. Do you just see, oh, that's a fence, which, you know, is in there? Or do you really delve into it and go, oh, well, that's a fence. Okay, so he's clearly made a barrier, and that must be his homestead. Why does he need a barrier? Why is he repainting this fence? Is it decaying? Why was it decaying? Is that a message about time, or is that a message about the person who lives there? And you can go over everything. That's one for another day. I literally have that on my list of how art brains work, which we will discuss at length. But probably I've been avoiding it because of the rambling nature of these kinds of podcasts. But Sean has clearly, who requested this topic, pushed me to it. So this is another thing coming up in the following weeks. If you do want to subscribe to my Patreon, I will be asking for topics. And it only takes $1. You can subscribe for as little as $1 to my Patreon, and you get special updates. You get things like this, where I take suggestions from you, and you get all those little things. But I'm hoping that this, in some way, has explained to you. It's probably revealed a fair amount about my work without maybe me intending to, and how I interpret other people's work, and probably revealed to you about how I might react to your own work. But who knows, within this crazy world of art and artists. I'm kind of, I'm in this depth at the minute of trying to figure out audience reaction and and how to put on something and get something in the public eye. That's something which I'm fighting with right now as I try to create work. And it's something which every artist will consider and try and get through. But let me know what you think. Let me know how you sit on the scale of art. You know, where you're kind of hanging out and viewing things. And maybe we'll come together and create something artistic together. That'd be wonderful, wouldn't it? But thank you for listening. And thank you for all your kind comments. And I will talk to you guys later.